Welcome to Physics Essentials. Today we'll be looking at the scientific method. Now, what is the scientific method? This is simply a series of steps that are taken when investigating a certain phenomenon. It can be simplified into 4 main steps. These include observation, hypothesis, experimenting, and conclusion. During the observation stage, you make sense of your environment and or identify a certain problem. For example, how does the length of a simple pendulum affect its period? So you have your simple pendulum and you would have made some observation of it making an oscillation, which is simply a back and forth movement. And so you want to now find out how does the length of the pendulum affect its period. So that's your observation, or that's the interest or the problem that you would have identified. Then you're going to formulate your hypothesis. This is an explanation, or what we would like to call an educated guess of what is the reason or a possible solution for what you have observed. Now, this is based on background information, so of course you would do some research to find out what others have to say about how does the length of the pendulum affects its period. So, our hypothesis could be increasing the length of a simple pendulum will cause an increase in its period. Then we will move on to conducting an experiment. This is where you complete certain tests so as to collect data. This data will then be analyzed to find trends that may explain the hypothesis. So, our hypothesis earlier was that an increase in the length of the pendulum will cause an increase in its period. So, we would alter the length of the pendulum to find out how the period is affected. Now, when you are conducting your experiment, you want to look at certain variables. There are 3 types of variables to consider when conducting an experiment. These include, so we first have our independent, or what we like to call the manipulated variable. From the name manipulated, this is the variable that is being altered or investigated. Please note that only one variable is altered at a time. So, according to our example, we would alter the length of the pendulum to see how it affects the period. So that means our period would be our dependent or responding variable. But what is our dependent or responding variable? This is simply the variable that may be affected by a change in the independent variable. Note the term may be affected, so it's based on the experiment that we would now find out whether or not this variable is affected by our independent or manipulated variable. Then we have our controlled variables, and these are very important. All the variables that are kept constant during an experiment are known as your controlled variables. In this case, we would keep the mass of the bulb constant, in keeping the mass of the bulb constant, we would only be focusing on the length of the pendulum. As remember, we can only alter one variable at a time. So we could not be altering the length of the pendulum whilst altering the mass of the bulb. If we do so, our results would not be valid. Then the final stage would have been formulating our conclusion, or drawing conclusion based on the evidence or the results of our experiment. So this basically states whether or not the hypothesis is true. So after conducting our experiment, we could conclude that the longer the length of the pendulum, the longer was its period. And that would be us using the scientific method to carry out this experiment to find out how does the length of the pendulum affect its period. Thank you so much for watching.